For most of my life, I believed love was something you earned by giving more than you had. My name is Lauren Miller. I was 30 years old, and I had spent years trying to secure a place in my family by being useful, agreeable, and invisible when necessary. I thought that if I worked harder, stayed later, sacrificed quietly, they would eventually see me. The morning of my sister's wedding felt like my final chance to prove that I mattered. I had planned every detail, stayed up through countless nights answering emails, double-checking menus, coordinating flowers, and smoothing over every potential problem. I told myself it was worth it, because if the day went perfectly, maybe I would finally be appreciated. The house in Brookfield buzzed with activity from early morning. Relatives filled the rooms with laughter, heels clicked across hardwood floors, and voices drifted from the kitchen in overlapping conversations. I moved through it all with practiced efficiency, carrying boxes and checking lists, my stomach tight with nerves. In my bag, I held a small velvet box containing a necklace I had saved for months to buy, a delicate silver chain with a sapphire pendant. It had cost me $2,500, money I could barely spare, but I believed that if I gave my sister something beautiful enough, she might finally look at me with gratitude, even if only for a moment. As the morning wore on, I carried a final container of wedding programs into the living room. My mother, Eleanor, stood by the fireplace, adjusting her pearl earrings, the ones she wore when she wanted to appear important. She looked up at me with a sharp, assessing gaze I knew too well. My father, Thomas, sat nearby with a cup of coffee, silent as always, observing without intervening. My mother's voice was calm, controlled, and devastating. She told me to stay invisible that day, not to ruin my sister's moment. There was no anger in her tone, only certainty, as if she were stating a simple fact. The words hit harder than shouting ever could. My chest tightened as I waited for her to laugh, to tell me she was joking. She didn't. I turned to my father, searching for any sign of hesitation or defense. He only nodded, his jaw set, as though the decision had already been made. In that moment, something inside me cracked. My sister appeared on the stairs wearing a silk robe, her hair half pinned, her attention fixed on her phone. She glanced at me briefly, then looked away, uninterested. I wanted to speak, to say anything, but my throat closed around the words. The house continued buzzing around me, yet everything felt muted, distant. I realized how foolish I had been to think the necklace, or my effort, or my years of sacrifice would ever change my role. My mother turned back to arranging flowers, her request final. I stood there, holding the programs, humiliation pressing down on me, as relatives passed by with awkward smiles, pretending not to notice what had just happened. No one spoke up. No one intervened. They simply moved on, as if I had already disappeared. After a moment, I set the programs down and quietly excused myself. I walked down the hallway to the coat closet where my bag rested, my movements mechanical. I placed the necklace box inside, zipped the bag, and inhaled the familiar scent of my mother's perfume lingering in the air. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed from the dining room, as though the house had already forgotten I existed. I stepped outside into the cool morning air around 10:30 a.m., the sound of distant church bells floating through the neighborhood. For a brief moment, I considered going back inside, apologizing for something I hadn't done, shrinking myself one last time. Instead, I walked down the steps, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, and slid into my car. As I started the engine, the hum drowned out the last echo of my mother's voice. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house I had grown up in, crowded with people preparing to celebrate without me. No one noticed as I drove away. The road out of Brookfield stretched ahead, empty and uncertain, but for the first time in years, it also felt strangely freeing. I drove without a destination, only one certainty guiding me forward. I would not stay invisible anymore. The farther I drove, the more the words replayed in my head like a command etched into bone. Stay invisible. The road was quiet, fields rolling past in orderly rows, and I kept both hands on the wheel, as if loosening my grip would let the panic rush in. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. My phone lay dark on the passenger seat, and each mile felt like I was crossing some invisible border I had been afraid to approach my entire life. I told myself they would call any minute and demand I come back, and the old version of me would obey. But no call came, and that silence was its own kind of answer. By late morning, hunger pulled me into a rest stop outside Dayton. The diner smelled like bacon grease and strong coffee, the kind of place where truckers kept their eyes on their plates and nobody asked too many questions. I slid into a booth and ordered eggs and toast, eating slowly while I stared through the window at my car in the parking lot. A waitress with tired eyes refilled my cup and asked if I was traveling far. I told her I was just passing through. She nodded as if she'd heard that line from people running from something they couldn't name. When I paid and stepped back outside around noon, the knot in my stomach had loosened. Not because the pain was gone, but because I had finally chosen something for myself. I drove back toward my apartment on the edge of Brookfield, not because it felt like home, but because it was the only place that was technically mine. Even that was a lie in practice. My parents treated my space like an extension of theirs, dropping by when they pleased, expecting access, expecting my availability. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the silence hit hard. I set my bag down, and the velvet box slipped out and landed on the coffee table with a soft thud. The sapphire pendant caught the light, bright and hopeful, in a room that suddenly felt like a waiting area for a life I'd never been allowed to live. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. Something inside me had shifted past tears into clarity. I pulled out my laptop and opened a blank document. For a long time, my fingers hovered over the keys, as if my body still expected permission. Then I began typing a list of everything that tethered me to them. Bank accounts, bills, the lease, my job, the phone plan, every thread they could pull to drag me back. The act of writing it down made it real. This wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a decision, a dismantling. The first and most urgent step was money. Years earlier, my parents had convinced me to set up a joint account for family expenses, especially for my mother's medications and household bills. I had poured most of my savings into it, always told it was the right thing to do, always made to feel selfish if I hesitated. Now, I could see it clearly. It wasn't a family account. It was a leash. I scrolled through my contacts and stopped at a number I hadn't expected to use in this way. Mark Henderson, a lawyer I'd met months earlier at a networking event in Columbus. Sharp but calm, the kind of person who listened without interrupting. I hesitated, then called. When he answered, his voice was steady, and something about that steadiness made my own words spill out in a rush. I told him about the wedding morning, the command to stay invisible, the years of giving, and the joint accounts that my parents could access whenever they wanted. I told him I needed out. I needed protection from them draining what I had built. Mark didn't react with shock or judgment. He simply said we could freeze the accounts temporarily while sorting the details, that I had every right to protect my contributions. The relief that washed through me felt almost dizzying. He asked if I could come into his office the next morning in Columbus. I agreed without overthinking, because if I paused too long, guilt would creep in and shove me back into the familiar cage. After I hung up, I sat on the couch staring at the wall, my heartbeat loud in the quiet. The day blurred into small, decisive movements. I packed a suitcase with clothes and essentials, tucked my journal and laptop inside, and set it by the door. I cleared dishes from the sink, threw old magazines into the trash, moved through the apartment as if erasing my imprint. Each action felt final, not dramatic, just resolved. When my phone buzzed in the afternoon with a message from an unknown number, Asking where I was, my chest tightened. I deleted it without replying. That night, sleep came in short fragments. Every time I drifted off, my mind snapped back to the image of my sister in her robe, my parents' faces set with certainty, the casual cruelty of telling me to disappear. By dawn, the exhaustion sat heavy behind my eyes, but the decision still felt right. I showered, dressed, grabbed the suitcase, and left the necklace box on the coffee table. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I also couldn't carry it like an offering anymore. It stayed behind like a marker of the person I was done being. The drive to Columbus took about an hour, the city waking around me as I parked near Mark's office. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Mark greeted me with a firm handshake and spread papers across the conference table. He explained what we would file, what freezing the accounts meant, and how to document everything properly. He warned me gently that once we began, it would set a boundary that would be difficult to undo. I told him that was exactly the point. As I signed, my hand steadied with each stroke. Somewhere back in Brookfield, my parents were likely smiling for cameras, raising glasses, insisting the wedding day was flawless. They had no idea their control was already slipping. By the time I walked out of Mark's office with the paperwork tucked into my bag, the morning sun glinted off glass buildings, and I felt something unfamiliar settle into me. Not happiness, not peace, but a kind of quiet power. The sense that I was finally walking toward a life I chose. And yet, as I sat in my car with the door open, breathing in the cool air, the relief began pulling old memories to the surface, as if every signature had unlocked a door to the past. I could see myself at 8 years old, holding up a drawing I'd worked on for days, hoping it would be praised, only to watch my mother's attention swing instantly to my sister's newest achievement. I could see the shelf in our living room where trophies and awards were displayed under perfect lighting, while my small ribbons and quiet victories were tucked away because not everything needs to be on display. I could hear the message underneath it all, repeated in 100 different ways over the years. Don't compete. Don't ask. Don't take up space. Sitting there in Columbus, I realized the wedding morning hadn't created a new wound. It had simply spoken the old truth out loud. Stay invisible wasn't a one-time insult. It was the rule I had lived by, the role I had been trained to accept. The difference now was that I had finally stopped believing it was my job to obey. I drove back to my apartment that afternoon, feeling as though the city noise was muffled by something thicker than air. The papers from Mark's office sat in my bag like a quiet shield, but they also carried weight. They made everything real. I wasn't just upset. I wasn't just taking space. I was severing something that had defined my life for decades. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the apartment felt smaller than it ever had, as if it already knew I was leaving. The suitcase still waited by the door, half-packed, patient. I set my bag down and leaned against the counter, letting the exhaustion catch up to me. The rest of the day passed in a haze of small tasks that felt larger than they should have. I opened drawers, sorted through papers, and threw away things I had kept out of habit rather than need. As dusk settled, the sky outside the window turned soft shades of orange and pink. I sat on the floor with a mug of tea and watched the street below. Families walked dogs, children rode bikes, neighbors waved to one another. Life moved forward at an easy pace, while mine felt as though it had cracked open. My phone buzzed once on the table, a message from my father. I didn't read it. I turned the phone face down and let the screen go dark. That night, sleep came and went in broken pieces. I woke before dawn, my chest tight, the familiar reflex to check my phone clawing at me. I resisted it. Instead, I showered, dressed, and brewed coffee, the simple routine grounding me. The apartment was quiet, but it no longer felt like safety. It felt like a holding cell I had outgrown. The suitcase by the door seemed to hum with possibility. I knew I couldn't stay there much longer, not if I wanted the boundary I had drawn to hold. Later that morning, I found myself driving toward the church hall where the wedding reception would be held that evening. I told myself I just needed closure, a final look. I parked across the street and sat in my car, watching vendors unload flowers and trays of food. Bridesmaids laughed as they carried boxes inside. My mother stood at the entrance, pearls catching the light as she directed people with sharp gestures. My father checked his watch. They looked satisfied, proud, as if the day were unfolding exactly as planned. I watched for nearly half an hour. Not once did they glance toward my car. Not once did they hesitate, as if wondering where I was. That realization cut deeper than anger. I could vanish completely, and they would still smile for the cameras. I started the engine and drove away before the traffic light changed, my hands shaking on the wheel. Back at my apartment, I pulled the thick binder I had made for the wedding from a shelf and laid it on the table. Every receipt, every contract, every note was neatly organized in my handwriting. Hours of invisible labor stared back at me. I closed the binder and shoved it into a drawer, no longer interested in proof. The necklace box caught my eye again. I opened it and let the sapphire glint in the light. I had imagined my sister wearing it, imagined her smile. Now it felt like a relic of a version of myself who believed love could be purchased with sacrifice. I snapped the box shut and placed it in the suitcase, not as a gift, but as a reminder of what I was done giving. By late afternoon, my parents called twice. I let both calls ring out. I knew what they wanted: my presence, my compliance, my silence. I wasn't going to give them that anymore. I walked to a small diner nearby and ordered a cheeseburger, sitting alone in a cracked vinyl booth. The waitress asked if I was headed to a wedding. I said no, not anymore. She raised an eyebrow but didn't pry. As I ate, I imagined the reception starting without me, my absence exactly as requested. The thought should have crushed me. Instead, it felt like release. When I returned home, the sky had darkened. Music from downtown drifted faintly through the air. I sat on the couch with my journal open and wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote about the years of shrinking, the nights spent making myself useful, the sting of being told to disappear. By the time fireworks lit the sky signaling the end of the reception, I felt hollowed out and clear. Standing on the balcony, watching the bursts of light fade, I whispered words I had never allowed myself to say before. I was done. The decision that followed wasn't impulsive. It was methodical. I made lists, checked savings, calculated penalties. I searched rental listings in towns where no one knew my family name, coastal places with low rent and no history. Around midnight, I closed my laptop and stared at the packed suitcase. It no longer felt like escape. It felt like direction. Sleep came thin but steady. When my phone buzzed before dawn with my parents' names lighting up the screen, I let it ring. A text followed asking where I was. I turned the phone face down and let the silence return. By mid-morning, the streets of Brookfield were quiet, still recovering from celebration. I loaded the suitcase into my car, sat behind the wheel, and waited for guilt to pull me back. It didn't. Instead, there was calm, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to prove. As I pulled onto the highway, leaving Brookfield behind, I understood something with startling clarity. In telling me to stay invisible, my family had given me permission I didn't know I needed. I could disappear from their story and finally begin my own. The drive away from Brookfield felt different this time. Not frantic or desperate, but deliberate. The town shrank in my mirrors, and with it, the version of myself who had spent years waiting for permission to live. I headed toward Columbus first, knowing there were still practical ties to cut. My stop at Mark Henderson's office was brief but decisive. He confirmed the freeze was fully in place and that any attempt to withdraw funds without proper documentation would be blocked. Hearing it out loud settled something deep in my chest. For the first time, the money I had earned and saved was no longer a tool my parents could use to pull me back. From there, the dismantling of my old life accelerated. Back at the apartment, I began selling furniture, donating clothes, boxing up what little truly belonged to me. Each item that left the space felt like shedding a layer of obligation. When my father left a voicemail accusing me of betrayal and warning me to undo what I had done, I deleted it without saving. The fear his voice used to trigger was gone, replaced by something steadier, almost defiant. A day later, my friend Claire knocked on my door, took one look at the half-empty apartment, and asked if I was really doing this. When I said yes, she told me she was proud of me. The words landed differently than my parents' praise ever had. They didn't come with conditions. I resigned from my job, with a short email citing personal reasons. 9 years ended in a few sentences. I expected panic to follow, but instead, there was relief. By the end of the week, everything I owned fit into my car. I handed in my keys, stood for a moment in the bare living room, and listened to the silence. No demands, no expectations, just space. As I drove away, the highway opened ahead of me, miles of possibility stretching forward. I didn't know exactly where I was going, only that I was headed south, toward a coastal town I'd chosen almost at random, because it was affordable and unfamiliar. The first night, I stopped at a roadside motel near Lexington. The room smelled faintly of smoke, the neon sign buzzed outside the window, and I slept with my phone turned off. In the morning, I traced the route toward the ocean on a paper map, my finger lingering over a small town called Seabrook. Something about it felt right. By the time I arrived, the air smelled of salt and pine. The streets were narrow, lined with old houses draped in vines. The cottage I rented was small and worn, with creaky floors and peeling paint, but when the landlord handed me the keys without asking questions, it felt like a gift. I signed the lease under my middle name, not as a disguise, but as a quiet beginning. When the door closed behind him, I stood alone in the empty space and felt a calm I had never known. The days that followed were simple in the best way. I walked the marsh trails at dawn, unpacked my laptop, and set up freelance profiles offering marketing work. Small projects came in, enough to cover groceries and rent. Each completed job felt like proof that I could support myself without sacrificing my autonomy. I found a cafe called Saltwater Brew, where the owner, Maria, welcomed me with warmth and coffee on the house. She didn't ask where I came from or why I was there. She just treated me like I belonged. The peace didn't last untouched. 3 weeks in, I turned on my old phone and was flooded with messages. My parents had taken their version of the story public, posting claims that I had abandoned them and stolen money meant for medical bills. Seeing my mother's picture paired with practiced sorrow made my hands shake. For a moment, the old instinct to defend myself surged. Then I called Mark. He was calm, methodical. He reminded me the records were clear, every expense documented, every contribution proven. If they pushed further, the truth would surface. Back in Seabrook, Maria told me something that stayed with me. Families, she said, often twist stories when they lose control. The best response is to live well anyway. I tried to let that be enough. When my sister finally messaged asking to talk, I read the words and closed the app without replying. I had waited years for her voice when it mattered. Now, silence was my answer. Life continued to knit itself together in quiet ways. I found part-time work at a small bookstore. Customers thanked me for recommendations. The owner trusted me without question. I joined a book club. I sat on my porch at night, listening to frogs and distant waves, writing in my journal about the life I wanted, not the one I had escaped. When accusations from home flared again, I let Mark handle them. Each attempt my parents made to regain control was denied, documented, and rendered powerless. One evening, standing at the edge of the marsh with the necklace box in my hand, I understood it was time to let go of the last symbol of who I used to be. I opened it and let the sapphire sink into the water, watching the ripples fade. It felt like a closing chapter. In telling me to stay invisible, my family had unknowingly given me a path. I disappeared from their world and discovered myself in my own. And for the first time, that was enough. The quiet of Seabrook settled into me slowly, not as an escape, but as a re-education. Mornings began with light spilling across the marsh, the air cool and clean, the sound of birds carrying over the water. I brewed coffee and sat at the small table by the window, working through freelance projects with a focus I had never known before. No one interrupted. No one expected me to drop everything for a crisis that wasn't mine. The hours belonged to me, and that alone felt radical. At the bookstore, the rhythm of honest work grounded me. Shelving books, helping customers find stories they didn't know they needed, learning the quiet language of regulars who returned week after week. Mrs. Whitaker trusted me with keys and opening shifts. She praised my reliability without comparing me to anyone else. The simplicity of it healed something in me that years of striving never had. I wasn't exceptional there, and I wasn't invisible. I was simply present, and that was enough. The past, however, refused to vanish quietly. News from Brookfield filtered in through messages and forwarded posts. My parents doubled down, giving interviews that painted me as ungrateful and reckless, a daughter who had drained family resources and disappeared. Seeing my name reduced to a headline tightened my chest, but the panic no longer ruled me. Mark released a brief statement outlining the facts, the trust's purpose, and the documentation behind every decision. He advised restraint, reminding me that truth didn't need volume to carry weight. I listened. When my sister's marriage began to fracture under the pressure of our parents' control, the irony landed heavy but hollow. Her husband reached out once, admitting he finally understood what living under that scrutiny felt like. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I no longer needed to be the translator of pain. Some lessons had to be learned without my labor. There were moments when guilt resurfaced, sharp and familiar. It came late at night, whispering that I had abandoned people who needed me. I learned to answer it with evidence. The bank notices confirming denied withdrawals, the doctor's emails stating there was no emergency, the steady income I built without sacrificing myself. Each piece formed a quiet rebuttal. Choosing myself wasn't cruelty. It was correction. One evening, a woman at the bookstore recognized my name and offered sympathy without curiosity. She said she knew enough to understand the story wasn't what it seemed. That kindness, unearned and uncomplicated, unraveled me more than any accusation ever had. I stepped into the back room and let the tears come. Not from hurt this time, but from relief. Someone believed me without needing proof. As weeks turned into months, Seabrook became familiar. Maria saved me a seat at the cafe and slipped extra pie onto my plate. The book club laughed loudly and welcomed my opinions. The marsh trails knew my footsteps. I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. The space they once occupied began to close, not with anger, but with indifference. On a clear night, I stood on the porch watching stars appear one by one, steady and patient. I thought about the girl I had been, the one who learned early that praise was scarce and conditional, that harmony mattered more than truth, that being useful was safer than being seen. I wished I could tell her that none of it was her fault, that love should not require erasure, that one day she would choose distance not as punishment, but as protection. I understood then that invisibility had two meanings. One was imposed, a shrinking enforced by others' comfort. The other was chosen, a stepping out of a narrative that demanded too much. When my family told me to stay invisible, they meant for me to disappear within reach. They never imagined I would vanish beyond it, building a life they could no longer edit. The peace I found wasn't loud or triumphant. It was practical. It showed up in paid bills, quiet mornings, work done well, friendships formed without obligation. It lived in the freedom to say no without explanation and yes without fear. It taught me that boundaries don't need permission to exist, and that walking away can be an act of profound self-respect. I didn't know what the future would bring, only that it would be mine to navigate. The road ahead felt open, unmarked, honest. And as I closed the door on the night and turned off the light, I carried one certainty with me into sleep. I was no longer unseen. I was finally choosing to see myself. The last messages from Brookfield arrived quietly, without drama, as if even the storm there was growing tired. A final notice from the bank confirmed what I already knew. Another attempt to withdraw funds had been denied, the account sealed by rules that could not be bent by guilt or reputation. I read the email at the small kitchen table, sunlight warming the wood, and felt a calm settle into my body that had nothing to do with winning. It was simply the absence of fear. For the first time, there was no waiting for the next demand, no bracing for impact. Life in Seabrook continued in small, grounding ways. I worked mornings at the bookstore, afternoons on freelance projects, evenings on the porch with tea as the marsh breathed and insects hummed. People learned my name and used it kindly. Customers returned to thank me for recommendations. Maria waved me over at the cafe and asked how my week had been, not because she needed anything, but because she cared. The difference between obligation and connection became unmistakable. One took from me, the other gave back. There were moments when the past knocked harder. An article circulated again, recycled accusations framed as concern. A voicemail arrived, clipped and cold, warning me that consequences were coming. I deleted it without listening twice. The power in that act surprised me. I didn't need to perform resilience or announce my independence. Silence, when chosen, was no longer submission. It was sovereignty. I thought often about the idea of family, how it had been defined for me as endurance and obedience, as proximity no matter the cost. Here, I learned a different definition. Family could be the woman who saved you a seat, the friend who said she was proud of you without asking for proof, the employer who trusted you with keys, the customers who returned because you listened. Family could be chosen, built, and sustained without shrinking. One evening, as the tide rolled in and the light thinned, I walked to the edge of the marsh and stood where the water widened. I remembered the necklace slipping beneath the surface weeks earlier, the ripples fading until the water went still. That moment hadn't been about anger. It had been about release, letting go of the belief that if I gave enough, I would be allowed to matter. Letting go of the version of myself that mistook sacrifice for love. I didn't feel triumphant about my parents' loss of control or my sister's unraveling marriage. I felt resolved. Their choices had consequences, just as mine did. I could acknowledge the grief without returning to the fire. I could hold compassion without handing back the keys to my life. That balance, I learned, was the real work. The lesson arrived quietly and stayed. Boundaries are not walls meant to punish others. They are doors that protect what's inside. Leaving did not make me heartless. Staying would have made me disappear. Choosing myself was not an act against my family. It was an act for my future. And sometimes the bravest love is the one that refuses to be negotiated. As months passed, the story they told about me lost its heat. Truth doesn't rush, it waits. Meanwhile, I built something steady, a routine that fit, work that paid honestly, friendships that didn't demand proof of worth. I stopped rehearsing explanations. I stopped hoping for apologies. I stopped measuring my life against a standard designed to keep me small. I used to believe being seen required permission. I was wrong. Being seen begins when you decide to look at yourself without flinching. When you stop asking others to validate the cost you've already paid. When you choose a path because it's right for you, not because it's acceptable to them. If you've ever been told to stay invisible, to be quieter, smaller, easier, know this: invisibility can be reclaimed. You can step out of a story that erases you and write another that holds. Distance can be an act of care. Silence can be a form of truth. And walking away, when it's done with clarity, can be the beginning of a life that finally fits. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced the choice between belonging and becoming, share your thoughts in the comments. Like the video if it helped you feel less alone. Subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your life, and share it with someone who might need to hear that choosing yourself is not selfish. It's necessary.